Hello, everybody. Welcome to tonight's edition of From the Boardroom to the Locker Room. And this evening, we're very honored to welcome, all the way from the United Kingdom, Tim Crowe. Tim is writing a book about the great Clive Rice. Tim, first of all, welcome to the program and thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me. It's nice to be with you.
So give us a bit of a background on Tim Crowe before we get into the reason why you've decided to write a book on Clive Rice and, in fact, what made you decide to write the book on Clive.
Sure. Okay. This will be my first book. Always wanted to write a book. I'll tell you a little story about that shortly. But I've been in sports marketing all my life. I started off in the marketing department of what was called in those days the Test and County Cricket Board, now called the England and Wales Cricket Board, who run cricket in this country, and that was my sort of first proper job in sport. And then I was in a succession of sports marketing agencies, one of which was called Synergy, the second one, which I was chief executive of for 10 years, worked all over the world, advising mostly sponsors on their sports marketing. And I left that agency in 2017 and became what they tell me is a pluralist. So I have many different things that I do now. I sit on the board of a few companies. I advise all sorts of companies about sport and the business of sport, brands, rights holders in sport, some media companies, and so on. I also make a joke that I'm the oldest guy in esports. I'm 62 in a few days' time, but I manage a lady called Mia Stelberg, who is a legend in esports. She was the first sort of sports psychologist in esports, coaching these youngsters who play esports for tremendous amounts of money in how to develop mental strength and resilience and the ability to win. And I've been managing Mia now for 5 or 6 years. Very exciting times in esports because of their increasing involvement with the Olympics. Lots of news coming up there soon. So that's me, that's my career. Always wanted to write a book. Ricey was a hero of mine when I was a kid. I saw him first play. I grew up in Yorkshire, and I saw Notts play Yorkshire at Bradford Park Avenue in 1978 in a Gillette Cup game. Knew a little bit about Clive Rice, but not much.
Yeah.
And I could not believe, and neither could my mates. I mean, we got the bus over from Halifax to Bradford and cricketing, mad kids. And we couldn't believe what we saw. Yorkshire was a pretty decent team. We had some very fine bowlers, Chris Auld, Graham Stevenson, Arnie Sidebottom, bowlers to reckon with. And Ricey came out to bat, either number 3 or 4, and just toyed with them. And I can still see in my mind's eye him hitting the ball back past them on the up, off the back foot, just toyed with them and got, I think, 60 or 70, something like that in no time. It was a rain-affected match. So they came back on day 2, and then out he comes to bowl, and this guy's bowling like the wind as well. So here's a guy who bats at 4, opens the bowling and bowls like the wind. We couldn't believe what we saw, quite apart from the charisma of the guy. He wasn't Notts captain at the time. He became Notts captain the next year after the Packer series, which he played in that following winter. But he had just this incredible charisma. Vic Marks, who I interviewed, one of many ex-players who I've interviewed, said about Ricey, he always looked like $1 million, a very imposing figure, and he just had something about him. So he became a hero of mine, and I then got to know him a bit because when I was at Lord's, Notts obviously were doing very well, and one of my jobs was to liaise between the broadcasters and the teams and so on at televised matches. And in those days, it was all BBC coverage, and Notts were doing very well. The Beeb would always want to interview the winning captain afterwards. It was always Notts who won, so it was always Ricey who was interviewed. So I got to know him a bit through that. And through the MCC bicentenary game, he was picked to play for MCC in their bicentenary game in 1987. And the MCC asked me to look after the media side, media relations with the players for that, because they didn't really do that. And a lot of the press wanted to speak to Ricey. So I got to know him a little bit through that as well. Anyway, fast forward to 2 years ago, my wife and I were going on holiday, and I thought that it would be good to read a book. And I thought I'll get a book about Ricey. It'd be great to read a book about Ricey on holiday. Discovered there wasn't one. So my wife said to me, well, why don't you do a book about Ricey? And she's been on me for years to do a book. So I thought, what a great idea. But I wanted to do it in the right way. So I got in touch with Clive's wife, Sue, and his daughter and son, Jackie and Mark, and his brothers, Richard and John, and asked for their blessing, which they gave me. And off I went.
Amazing, because, Tim, I listen to the way you speak, and we're the same age. And Ricey was a hero of yours. He was certainly a hero of mine, but more a foe than a hero, because I grew up watching him playing for Transvaal, but I was a Western Province supporter. So my absolute hero was, my hero was Eddie Barlow, and Clive Rice was always the thorn in Western Province's side in that mean machine. And he inspired me to become a commentator. Well, not just him, but obviously the way the cricket was played in those days, the brand of cricket. We obviously didn't play Test cricket in South Africa. So, New Year's, what we would call a New Year's test is for what we would know, Province versus Transvaal. I mean, that was some of the most competitive and serious cricket ever. And of course, here at Newlands, where he was loved but hated by the crowd, and they really loved to hate him. And then obviously I was very fortunate enough to spend some time with him over the years. I even raced a motor car against him. I mean, people don't realize. I think the one thing that if anybody ever said to me, what's your first impression of Clive Rice? I would say the grit and determination. He just did not know, first of all, the word lose, and he didn't know the word impossible. I mean, he was just absolutely incredible. Did you find that when you spoke to people as well?
Absolutely. That was one of his defining characteristics. Sue, his wife, once said, the best thing that anybody can do for Clive is to give him uphill. And I think that is possibly the truest thing that anybody ever said about Ricey, because go all the way through his life and his career, starting with when he was a very small boy at school, fighting to get into the Transvaal Nuffield schools team against guys who were much bigger than him, through to very last appearance for a province in South Africa for Natal, when he had his forearm broken, had to go off, and then came back out to bat after the ninth wicket fell with his arm in plaster, batting with one hand against Eldine Baptiste. This was defiance, and the will to win and the refusal to accept defeat was an absolutely defining characteristic of Ricey.
One of the things that amazed me about his success over the years was that he played in a team, along with himself, arguably in the modern era of cricket, if you like, after the Sir Garfield Sobers era, Richard Hadley. I mean, one of the greatest all-rounders, Test cricket greatest all-rounders there was. And the fact that Clive decided, I guess, to stick to his South African roots and not take that opportunity that the likes of Alan Lamb and the Smith brothers did by playing for England was also something that I presume comes up in the book.
It is, yeah. He was tempted to go to Australia, but when it became clear that isolation was going to last for a long time, he was tempted to go to Australia. He had offers from Australia, he had offers from New Zealand, he had offers from England, but he was a proud South African, and it is discussed in the book. And I don't want to say too much about the book, because I'd like people to read it when it comes out.
Of course,
but yeah, it is discussed. He wasn't short of offers, but as a proud South African, he wanted to stay.
You say this is your first attempt at writing a book. How do you condense a man's life like Ricey's, which was from motor racing driver to humanitarian to outstanding sportsman to a father to a husband to a fighter to somebody who would not decide ever that the impossible wasn't possible, to condense it into, I don't know how many pages the book is, but I mean, you could write 1,000 pages on a guy like Ricey.
You could. It's a very, very good question. I'm very fortunate in itself in that I'm able to write the first ever biography of Ricey. It's kind of amazing there hasn't been one before. I'm also fortunate in that the wealth of material is extraordinary. He lived an extraordinary life, and his story deserves to be told. And actually, I think to answer your question, there are two key things that you need to do. The first is to decide what is the story, what's the essence of the story. Friends, cricketers who've written books, all advise me that that's the one thing that you need to work out is what is the essence of the story. And then once you've done that, it's what drives the story forward. Because obviously you could, as you say, you could write 1,000 pages. I think the most important thing on top of that, I think if we're honest, anybody who's read a lot of cricketers' biographies would, I'm sure, agree that the standard often is not very high. Generally speaking, because especially if you go back a little bit, cricketers rushed books out to try and make some money when they got famous, when they became test players and so on. The sort of worst of the genre just talk about what happened on the field. And whilst that is important, what happened off the field too, and the stories that Rice's contemporaries, guys he played with and against, can tell to me are the most important. So I am doing literally, I've done over 100 interviews with players so far, and I'll probably do another 50, because I think that's really, really important to give that flavour of the man and what was going on, what was happening, alongside the matches. And of course, the bigger drama of what was happening in the world and the cricket world. Everybody knows what was going on in South Africa in those years. Tremendously difficult, obviously, and controversial in the outside world. You had the Packer series, which, again, tremendously controversial, which Ricey played in the second series of. All sorts of things going on in the world, which affected cricket. And as a result, I think you have to paint that larger context. So I guess to answer your question, you're absolutely right. My job, in a way, is more editor than it is writer, because there's so much great material.
Tim, it's interesting that you say cricket books are boring, and I agree with you. A lot of them are. But then again, and I don't say this with any disrespect to any cricketers I know, some of the greatest cricketers are boring. There's the odd, the Eddie Barlows and the Ian Bothams and those kind of guys who have these charismatic lives, and I put Ricey in amongst those. But I'm amazed at how brilliant in terms of the title of the book, because having lived through that period that you talk about, and in particular the heartache that he went through not being chosen to lead South Africa at the 92 Cricket World Cup, of which I was very much a part of as the commentator that went over to Australia with the South African team.
Right.
After he went, of course, to India for that historic series against the Indians. Despite them, the Clive Rice Story. And it's such a brilliant title. I know how you would have come up with it, but I guess tell people how you came up with it.
Champion Despite Them is the title. It took a few months. Things were sort of bobbling around in my head. And I go back to that point around friends saying to me, if you can distill the story down into 3 or 4 words, that's really helpful. Derek Pringle said that to me several times, my old mate Derek Pringle.
Yeah.
In the England team when I was at the Teston County Cricket Board, and we're still good mates now, both collect vinyl records, but that's another story. Anyway, I sat down and I wrote down what you call a word cloud. You've probably heard the phrase.
Yeah.
But I wrote down the sort of recurring words and ideas and themes that had come out when I was talking to people about Ricey, reading about him, reading what he'd said, and so on. And the word that kept coming up was champion. I mean, he was, of course, a champion. He was driven to win. He had an unbelievable will to win. That's really important. And then the despite them came about through 2 things. The first was that he was a controversial character. Sometimes he brought controversy on himself. Sometimes controversy engulfed him. But it goes back to that point about defiance and the refusal to accept defeat, no matter from what direction the opponent was coming. And despite them came from the headstone of Rob Roy McGregor in the Scottish Highlands. My wife and I went up there years and years ago. Years ago. My wife has something about Scotland. She's sort of drawn there, we discovered why actually not very long ago. We did an ancestry DNA profile of her, and she's 30% Scottish. So that's why it is. But anyway, again, I digress. We went up to Rob Roy's Glen, and his headstone is there, and it says on the headstone, McGregor despite them. McGregor despite them. And I thought that despite them was perfect for Ricey. It encaptured that controversy, that, to say, the defiance, and he fought against many people in his life and many things. Sometimes he was on the right side of the argument. Sometimes some people would say he wasn't. You know, when he came back from Kerry Packer from World Series cricket, he famously got into a tremendous row with Transvaal about being paid to play in the Datsun final and in the final Currie Cup game of the season. Tremendous row about that. But he stuck to his guns. He didn't think players were paid enough. And many players have said to me how he inspired them, because he said, look, we're not being paid enough for what we do. We're entertainers, we pack in the crowds, and we're not being paid enough. You know. So anyway, I thought the champion despite them really, really worked. So that's the title.
Amazing. I'd love to talk much more about what's in the book, but I guess, as you say, we want people to read the book. But I guess if I may, because clearly you've done an extraordinarily large amount of research, what do you think Clive Rice would think about cricket in 2024?
I think he would love limited overs game, the white ball stuff. Ricey was a visionary when it came to cricket formats and innovation. Long before he won the World All-Rounders Challenge, famously, he won it 3 years out of 4 against Ian Botham, Richard Hadley, Imran Khan, Kapil Dev, Malcolm Marshall. He had talked about creating something like that. Obviously, he played, you will know very well, he played many single wicket matches, particularly against Mike Proctor, you know, which would pack out the Wanderers. Played in a lot of double wicket stuff too back in those days. But yeah, he loved new formats. He loved night cricket. He could sense that the longer form of the game, he loved the longer form of the game, don't get me wrong. You know, he loved the closest thing that he ever got to playing Test cricket was Packer. He loved that. And Packer and all the innovation, the marketing, the floodlights, the way the game was sold and broadcasted, that had a profound influence on him. So he would enjoy that. I think he would be very wary, like many cricketers of his generation, of the marginalisation of red ball cricket, particularly Test cricket. I suspect, in fact, I know, I can hear him saying it. I think he would be pretty critical of administrators for the way they are running the game. I think he would applaud and love the fact that cricketers are now being paid what they're worth. Can you imagine what Clive Rice, in his pomp, the fast bowling, world-class fielder, world-class batsman, can you imagine what he'd be worth now on the circuit? They would be queuing up to sign him.
I can also imagine his ability as a captain in a T20 game, particularly, I mean, would be just unbelievable. I mean, he had a cricketing brain that was like a Formula One racing driver. He could see the next corner before they got to the one that they were about to turn on.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, you know, I think he would broadly welcome much of it. But I think there would be other areas that would concern him. And it would be interesting to talk to him for sure.
I would hate to think what his thoughts would be on South Africa's cricket administrators over the last decade, let alone the rest of the world. But I mean, particularly, and I guess he would also have a lot to say about the BCCI taking over cricket the way they have and controlling it the way they do.
Yes, well, Kerry Packer famously said that the extraordinary thing about what he did was it cost him so little, effectively, buy cricket, take it over at the top level. When I was at Lord's back in the second half of the 1980s, it was very obvious then that when India got its act together, it would be the ultimate force in the game financially. I was lucky enough to go to India many times in those years and subsequently, and I advised a lot of brands in cricket, including Indian brands. And the money that was coming into the game, I worked out once, I forget when it was, but it was long before IPL and so on. But even in the sort of mid-90s, something like that, 80% of the money that was coming into the world game was coming from India. And that's before India really got its act together. So I think he did a lot of business in India. Kapil Dev was a close friend of his. Obviously, he became, India was very much part of his story because famously he took after Madiba came out, he took the Indian team, the South African team to India for those first 3 one-day internationals. And then equally famously, for those of you who watched the documentary, he went to India to have laser surgery to try and have his tumour removed. And it did remove it successfully. So India was a big part of his story. So I'm sure he would have interesting things to say about that. He loved India deeply.
Tim, we could talk like you can write 1,000 pages. We can most probably talk about 1,000 hours on this wonderful game and the wonderful Clive Rice and how much we all enjoyed watching him. I mean, one of my most memorable visions of him, which amongst all the brilliance of his batting and bowling and his tenacity, was I don't think anybody's ever rolled his sleeve up more than Clive Rice ever did. I mean, it was something as a youngster that I watched, and I just couldn't understand, first of all, why he wore long sleeves in the middle of summer. And then he kept rolling it up, and every time he bowled, it came down. I mean, there's just these little quirks about the guy that just made him so special.
Yeah, and the handlebar moustache.
Yeah.
He was quite something. So many people mention that. A lot of fans, I'm part of a couple of Facebook groups that are full of South African cricket fans, and so many of them talk about being boys and emulating that, walking back to their mark and rolling up their sleeve like Clive Rice.
Yeah. Unbelievable. Absolutely amazing. And I mean, one of the other memories that I have, and I don't know if anybody's ever mentioned it to you, was him taking that photograph naked with a cricket bat in front of his private parts. I mean, that's the kind of guy that we're talking about, which is why I say there aren't that many charismatic cricketers like the ones that you've mentioned, and obviously Ricey and Botham and so on in the game. I mean, now we do have more by virtue of television coverage and all the rest of it. Right, final question and most important one. When's the book going to be out? How far are you? And when is it going to be ready for distribution and for us to buy?
Well, I don't know yet. The answer is I'm probably about halfway through. Happy with where I'd like to be, but I made Sue and the family a promise that I would try and write the best cricket biography that's ever been written. And, I'm trying to do that. And that does mean a lot of interviews in particular and a lot of research, and then trying to distill it all into a great book. So I can't answer your question yet, as soon as possible, obviously, but it'll be ready when it's ready.
I cannot wait, and I'm sure we'll catch up with you before the publication comes out, and maybe we'll get a little bit more of an insight. Maybe I'll be able to pry a little bit more out of you, maybe something that people will go, I'd like to hear about that, because they might not have known that.
Well, I can tell you that there will be a lot in the book that people do not know.
Good.
And that people will find, I think, very surprising.
Love to know a little bit more about Peter van der Merwe, but that's another story.
Yes.
So it's been an absolute pleasure. All the best continuing to write the book. And as I say, we'll catch up with you again soon. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.
That's tonight's edition of From the Boardroom to the Locker Room. If you were not able to ever see Clive Rice in action and you love cricket, go onto YouTube and find some old clips and see exactly what Tim and I have been talking about. Because as I said in the beginning of the interview, as much as he was a foe in terms of whom I supported and who I idolized as a youngster, my goodness, he was absolutely unbelievable. And he was also a hero of mine as well. Clive Rice, what a great guy, what a great man. Thanks, Tim. That's tonight's edition of From the Boardroom to the Locker Room. As always, on a night like tonight, be nice to each other. Until next time, bye for now.